In the heart of San Diego's bustling naval district, Lieutenant Commander Rose Washington stood before her mirror, adjusting her civilian clothes, a simple blue blouse and black slacks. After 15 years of distinguished service as one of the few female Navy SEALs, she had learned to blend in seamlessly with the civilian world, keeping her extraordinary military career private. The autumn evening carried a slight chill as Rose drove her modest Honda Civic toward her grandmother's house in the historically black neighborhood of Logan Heights. The streets were familiar, every crack in the sidewalk, every corner store held memories of her childhood. Her grandmother had raised her here, instilling the values that would later drive her to break barriers in the military. At a red light, Rose noticed two police cruisers in her rearview mirror. She thought nothing of it initially, but when both cars suddenly flashed their lights, her military training kicked in. Something wasn't right. Following protocol, she signaled and pulled over, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. The officers approached aggressively, weapons drawn. "Get out of the vehicle with your hands up," one shouted. Rose complied calmly, her mind racing but her exterior remaining composed. She knew the drill, she'd heard too many stories from friends and family about similar situations. "Officers, I'm unarmed and complying. May I ask what this is about?" Rose's voice remained steady, professional. The response came in the form of rough handling as they pushed her against her car, cuffing her hands behind her back. "We've got reports of drug trafficking in this area, and your vehicle matches the description," one officer sneered. Rose knew this was false, her clean Honda Civic couldn't be further from suspicious. As they began searching her car without consent, she noticed neither officer had activated their body cameras. In the back of the police car, Rose listened as the officers discovered a package in her trunk, one she knew hadn't been there minutes ago. Her military intelligence training kicked in, and she began mentally recording every detail, badge numbers, exact times, specific words used. She recognized this for what it was, a setup. What the officers didn't know was that Rose wasn't just any civilian. Her years of naval intelligence had taught her to recognize patterns, and this had all the hallmarks of a coordinated operation. She also knew that her car, like many military personnel's vehicles, was equipped with a dashcam, one that had been recording everything. As they drove toward the precinct, Rose remained silent, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood pass by. The officers in front chatted casually, convinced they had made an easy arrest. They had no idea they had just attempted to frame one of the most decorated female Navy SEALs in history, someone who had not only completed the military's most rigorous training program but had also led countless successful intelligence operations. In the holding cell, Rose sat patiently, her mind already formulating multiple strategies. She knew the local police department had been under federal investigation for similar incidents, though nothing had stuck so far. Perhaps this wasn't just about her, perhaps this was an opportunity to expose a systemic issue that had been plaguing her community for years. As the night deepened, Rose could hear the officers outside discussing their successful drug bust. Little did they know, their actions had set in motion a chain of events that would shake the department to its core. Rose wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been wrongfully targeted in her neighborhood. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, "Sometimes, baby, God puts you in a position to fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you." As she waited for processing, Rose knew this wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about justice, reform, and ensuring that no one else would face what she was facing now. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Rose began counting the hours. She knew that by now, her absence would have been noticed at the base. Soon, wheels would begin turning that these corrupt officers couldn't possibly anticipate. The real question wasn't if she would be cleared, it was how many others she could help in the process. This was just the beginning of what would become one of the most significant police corruption cases in San Diego's history, and Rose Washington was uniquely positioned to see it through. As she sat in that cell, she wasn't just a wrongfully accused citizen, she was a highly trained operative about to embark on her most important mission yet, bringing justice to her own community. Dawn broke over San Diego as Rose's commanding officer, Captain Chen, received the call about her detention. His face darkened as he listened to the details. In his 25 years of service, he had never known Lieutenant Commander Washington to be anything but exemplary. Something wasn't adding up. Within hours, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, had quietly begun gathering information. Rose's impeccable service record spoke volumes: multiple commendations, successful missions in classified locations, and a reputation for unwavering integrity. The drug charges against her weren't just suspicious, they were completely out of character. Meanwhile, in the precinct, Rose was being processed with deliberate slowness. The officers who had arrested her seemed to be enjoying their power trip, unaware that their every action was being scrutinized. Rose noticed how they treated other detainees, particularly those from minority communities, with the same casual disdain they had shown her. "You'll be looking at serious time for this," one officer taunted as he fingerprinted her. "These charges aren't going away." Rose remained silent, but her trained eye caught the name on his badge, Officer Reynolds. She also noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the nervous glance he shared with his partner, signs of anxiety that any experienced operative would recognize. Back at the naval base, Captain Chen was meeting with NCIS investigators in a secure conference room. "Lieutenant Commander Washington isn't just any officer," he explained, sliding a heavily redacted file across the table. "She's been instrumental in some of our most sensitive operations. This arrest? It doesn't just threaten her career, it threatens national security." The NCIS team discovered something interesting. Officer Reynolds and his partner had been involved in 12 similar arrests in the past month alone. All in the same neighborhood, all with surprisingly similar circumstances, and all involving minority citizens. Most concerning was that none of the arrests had led to convictions. The charges were always dropped after the defendants accepted plea deals. Rose spent her second night in custody observing and listening. Her cell was next to a young woman named Tanya, arrested under circumstances eerily similar to her own. "They planted it in my car too," Tanya whispered through the wall. "Nobody believed me. My public defender said taking the plea deal was my only option." As Rose absorbed this information, she began piecing together a larger pattern. These weren't just random acts of corruption, this was a systematic operation targeting specific communities. Her military intelligence training helped her see the bigger picture: the consistent timing of arrests, the specific routes the officers patrolled, the pattern of plea deals. Outside the precinct, the wheels of justice were turning in unexpected ways. Captain Chen had contacted an old friend at the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. "We've been trying to build a case against this precinct for months," the FBI agent revealed. "But victims are too scared to come forward, and evidence keeps disappearing." What the corrupt officers didn't realize was that Rose's apparent isolation was an illusion. Her position in naval intelligence meant she had connections they couldn't imagine. More importantly, her military training had taught her to turn every disadvantage into an opportunity. On the third morning, Rose finally received her phone call. Instead of calling a lawyer, she dialed a number few civilians would recognize, a direct line to naval intelligence. Within hours, a plan was in motion that would transform her wrongful arrest into an opportunity to expose years of systemic corruption. The precinct's Internal Affairs Department suddenly found themselves dealing with inquiries from multiple federal agencies. The FBI, NCIS, and the Department of Justice were all showing unexpected interest in what should have been a routine drug arrest. Officer Reynolds and his partners began to sense that something was different about this case. In her cell, Rose continued gathering intelligence. Every conversation she overheard, every procedural violation she witnessed, every detail about other wrongful arrests, all of it was being carefully memorized and would soon become part of a federal investigation that would rock the department to its core. What started as an attempt to frame an innocent black woman was about to become the thread that would unravel years of corruption. The officers who thought they were dealing with just another victim had no idea they had inadvertently targeted someone trained to dismantle operations exactly like theirs. As the sun set on her third day in custody, Rose could sense the shift in atmosphere around the precinct. The confident swagger of corrupt officers was giving way to nervous glances and hushed conversations. Something was changing, and they could feel it. Their routine operation was about to expose corruption that reached far beyond a single wrongful arrest. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. Rose Washington wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was positioning herself to expose a criminal enterprise operating under the cover of law enforcement. The next phase would demonstrate why underestimating a Navy SEAL, especially one with extensive intelligence training, was a serious mistake. The fourth morning of Rose's detention brought unexpected visitors to the precinct. 2 FBI agents walked into the building, their presence sending ripples through the department. Officer Reynolds watched nervously as they headed straight for the chief's office, their faces bearing the stern expression of people who had uncovered something significant. Inside her cell, Rose had spent the night consoling a newly arrested grandmother who had been caught in the same trap, allegedly found with drugs in her car after a routine traffic stop. The woman's story matched the pattern perfectly: same officers, same location, same planted evidence. Rose's blood boiled, but her face remained calm. Years of SEAL training had taught her to channel anger into strategic thinking. Meanwhile, Captain Chen was meeting with a federal judge, presenting evidence that had been quietly gathered over the past 3 days. The dashcam footage from Rose's car had been recovered and analyzed, revealing the officers planting evidence. But more importantly, Rose's military-grade vehicle tracking system had recorded every movement of her car for the past month, proving she had never been near any of the locations the officers claimed she'd visited for drug trafficking. The precinct's internal affairs department was in chaos. Officer Reynolds and his partner had been called in for questioning, but something wasn't adding up. Their previous arrests were too clean, too perfectly documented. It was as if someone had carefully crafted each report to withstand scrutiny. This level of sophistication suggested involvement from higher up the chain of command. Rose's cellmate, Tanya, had been released that morning after the public defender discovered inconsistencies in her case. Before leaving, she had slipped Rose a note with names and dates, information about other victims of the same corrupt operation. Rose memorized the details before destroying the note, adding them to her mental database of evidence. In the afternoon, 2 senior detectives from Internal Affairs interviewed Rose. They expected to find a scared civilian. Instead, they encountered a highly trained intelligence officer who provided them with detailed observations of departmental procedures, patterns of behavior, and specific instances of misconduct she'd witnessed during her detention. "There's a larger operation at play here," Rose explained calmly, her military training evident in her precise analysis. The officers involved show signs of professional training in evidence manipulation. Their techniques are too sophisticated for street-level corruption. The detectives exchanged worried glances. They had suspected something similar but hadn't been able to prove it. Outside the precinct, the FBI's investigation was expanding. Agent Thompson, leading the case, had discovered links between the corrupt officers and a private security firm run by a former police captain. The firm had been winning lucrative contracts in neighborhoods where these wrongful arrests were most common, offering enhanced security services to frightened residents. Rose's grandmother had been busy too, rallying community leaders and former victims of police corruption. Her living room had become an unofficial headquarters for families sharing similar stories. The pattern was clear: arrests followed by pressure to accept plea deals, creating criminal records that made it harder for victims to find employment or housing, making them more dependent on the very security services profiting from their fear. Captain Chen received an encrypted message from Naval Intelligence. Rose's arrest had inadvertently interrupted a long-term operation tracking illegal weapons being sold through private security companies. The corruption in the police department wasn't just about drug charges, it was potentially part of a larger criminal enterprise. As evening approached, Officer Reynolds was seen leaving the precinct in a hurry, carrying files. Unknown to him, Rose's training in surveillance had taught her to recognize signs of someone preparing to flee. She had already anticipated this possibility and informed the FBI through her military contacts. The precinct security cameras captured an interesting scene that night, several high-ranking officers working late, shredding documents and deleting files. They didn't realize that everything they were trying to destroy had already been backed up by federal investigators, thanks to Rose's early warning about potential evidence tampering. In her cell, Rose maintained her calm demeanor, but her mind was racing. She had identified at least 3 different corruption schemes operating simultaneously within the department: the false arrests, the security company connection, and something bigger that she was still piecing together. Her SEAL training had taught her to look for patterns within patterns, and something about the weapon trafficking angle felt important. The night shift brought new officers to the precinct, and Rose noticed something interesting: their behavior was different. These officers seemed uncomfortable with the situation, exchanging uncertain looks when they thought no one was watching. Rose recognized the signs of a department divided. Not everyone was part of the corruption, but fear and loyalty had kept them silent. Late that night, Rose received another visitor, a senior FBI agent who had worked with her on previous military operations. Their conversation was brief but significant. The FBI had enough evidence to move on the corrupt officers, but Rose's insights had uncovered something bigger. The question now was timing, when to strike to expose not just the corrupt officers, but the entire network behind them. As midnight approached, Rose could hear unusual activity in the precinct. Files were being moved, phones were ringing more frequently than normal for this hour, and there was a tension in the air that her military training helped her identify as pre-operation anxiety. The corrupt officers knew something was coming, but they didn't know what. What they couldn't know was that Rose's apparent vulnerability, being locked in a cell, had given her the perfect opportunity to observe their entire operation from the inside. Every nervous conversation, every suspicious movement, every attempt to cover their tracks had been noted and analyzed by someone trained to gather intelligence in much more challenging environments than this. Dawn of the 5th day brought unexpected activity to the precinct. Rose noticed the shift change was different. Several regular officers hadn't shown up for duty. Through the small window in her cell, she could see people in suits moving through the building with purpose. The corruption investigation was reaching a critical point. In a secure conference room across town, Captain Chen sat with federal investigators, reviewing the evidence they'd gathered. Rose's dashcam footage was playing on a screen, clearly showing Officer Reynolds planting evidence in her car. But it was what happened before the traffic stop that caught everyone's attention. Another police vehicle had been following Rose for miles, coordinating with Reynolds over an unauthorized radio frequency. "This isn't random harassment," Agent Thompson explained, pointing to a map covered in pins. "These arrests follow a pattern. Each one occurs within 2 blocks of properties recently acquired by shell companies. The same shell companies that contract with our corrupt officers' private security firm." The web of corruption was larger than anyone had initially suspected. Rose's grandmother had transformed her small house into an impromptu community center. Dozens of families had come forward with similar stories of planted evidence and forced plea deals. A pattern emerged: after each wrongful arrest, property values in the area would drop, allowing mysterious investors to buy up buildings at reduced prices. Back in her cell, Rose was mentally cataloging everything she'd observed. Her SEAL training had taught her to notice details others might miss. The nervous glances between officers, the late-night phone calls, the unusual patrol patterns, it all pointed to a coordinated operation that went beyond simple police corruption. Agent Thompson received an urgent call from his surveillance team. Officer Reynolds had been spotted meeting with a well-dressed man outside a downtown coffee shop. Photos revealed the man to be Thomas Bradford, CEO of Elite Security Solutions, the private firm winning all the security contracts in affected neighborhoods. More importantly, Bradford was a former police captain with connections to City Hall. Captain Chen's team made a breakthrough while analyzing financial records. The shell companies buying properties in affected neighborhoods all traced back to a single offshore account. The same account had made substantial payments to several high-ranking police officials through a complex network of transactions designed to avoid detection. Rose's military intelligence training proved invaluable as she helped federal investigators understand the department's internal communications. She had noticed patterns in shift changes, patrol routes, and radio communications that revealed a sophisticated system for identifying targets and coordinating false arrests. The community response was growing stronger. Rose's grandmother had organized a meeting with civil rights attorneys, who were amazed by the detailed documentation community members had kept. Years of suspicious arrests, property sales, and security contracts painted a picture of systematic displacement of longtime residents. Inside the precinct, tension was mounting. Officers who weren't part of the corruption began noticing federal agents conducting interviews in unused offices. Internal Affairs had set up a temporary command center, and rumors spread about sealed indictments. The corrupt officers could feel their control slipping away. That afternoon, Rose received another visit from her FBI contact. They spoke in hushed tones about a new development. Weapons traced from recent street crimes had serial numbers matching those from military shipments that had supposedly been destroyed. The private security firm was somehow involved in redirecting military equipment into civilian areas. A young officer approached Internal Affairs with startling information. He had discovered that the department's computer system had been modified to automatically flag certain vehicles and individuals for traffic stops. The targeting wasn't random. It focused on longtime residents in neighborhoods marked for development. Rose's cell became an unexpected command center. Her military experience in gathering and analyzing intelligence made her uniquely qualified to help investigators understand the complex web of corruption. Through carefully coded conversations with other inmates and observations of officer behavior, she continued building a comprehensive picture of the operation. As evening approached, surveillance teams reported unusual activity at Elite Security Solutions headquarters. Vehicles were seen leaving with boxes of documents, and lights burned late into the night. The corrupt officers were trying to cover their tracks, unaware that their every move was being monitored. Captain Chen received word from Naval Intelligence. They had connected the weapons trafficking operation to a larger national security concern. The same network moving military equipment through the private security firm had links to international arms dealers. What had started as an investigation into local police corruption had uncovered a threat to national security. In her cell, Rose could sense the change in atmosphere. The corrupt officers' usual confidence had been replaced by nervous energy. Their phones rang more frequently, their conversations were hushed, and their movements became erratic. Years of military training had taught her to recognize the signs of an operation about to unravel. As night fell, Rose noticed increased activity around the evidence room. Officers were working late, supposedly conducting an inventory, but her trained ear caught the sound of paper shredders running. What they didn't know was that federal agents had already secretly duplicated all relevant files days ago. The pieces were falling into place. The false arrests, the property schemes, the security contracts, and the weapons trafficking, it was all part of a larger operation to control and profit from entire neighborhoods. Rose's wrongful arrest had inadvertently provided the perfect opportunity to expose it all. The 6th day of Rose's detention marked a turning point. At precisely 6 a.m., FBI teams simultaneously raided 3 locations: Elite Security Solutions headquarters, a warehouse on the outskirts of town, and Officer Reynolds' home. The carefully orchestrated operation was the result of intelligence gathered over the past 5 days, much of it stemming from Rose's observations and military expertise. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Officers hurried through hallways, whispering urgently into phones. Through her cell window, Rose watched the police chief arrive unusually early, his face ashen as he was immediately confronted by federal agents with a search warrant for his office. Captain Chen was coordinating with NCIS at a secure location, reviewing shocking discoveries from the early morning raids. The warehouse contained not only documentation of the false arrests but also military-grade weapons that had been reported destroyed, clear evidence of a weapons trafficking operation operating under the guise of legitimate security operations. Rose's grandmother's house had become the heart of community resistance. Residents gathered there, sharing stories and providing statements to civil rights attorneys. The evidence they'd collected over years, photographs, recordings, detailed notes of suspicious police activity, was proving invaluable to federal investigators. In her cell, Rose continued her careful observation of the precinct's operations. Her SEAL training had taught her to recognize subtle signs of an organization in crisis. She noticed officers who had previously swaggered through the halls now moved quickly and nervously, avoiding eye contact. Some didn't show up for their shifts at all. The FBI's analysis of Elite Security Solutions computers revealed a sophisticated algorithm that identified potential targets for false arrests. The program considered factors like property values, resident demographics, and length of property ownership. It was a systematic approach to displacing long-term residents through false criminal charges. Agent Thompson made a breakthrough while interviewing a former Elite Security employee. The company hadn't just been providing security, they'd been orchestrating a complex scheme to drive down property values through manufactured crime statistics. The false arrests were just one part of a larger strategy to make neighborhoods appear more dangerous than they were. Rose's military intelligence background proved crucial in understanding the company's communication systems. She helped investigators decode a series of seemingly innocent text messages that revealed coordination between corrupt officers and private security personnel. The messages detailed everything from target selection to evidence planting. By midday, the investigation had uncovered links to City Hall. Several Planning Commission members had received substantial payments from the same offshore accounts connected to the property purchases. These officials had fast-tracked zoning changes in neighborhoods where residents had been targeted for false arrests. In the precinct's evidence room, federal agents discovered a hidden compartment containing dozens of identical packages of planted evidence, complete with pre-written police reports. The level of organization suggested this wasn't just a few corrupt officers, it was an institutional operation. Rose's cellmate from the previous day had been released and immediately contacted Rose's grandmother. She revealed that the private security firm had approached her months ago, offering to help her sell her family home at a fraction of its value. When she refused, she suddenly found herself arrested on false charges. Captain Chen received an encrypted message from naval intelligence containing satellite imagery of the warehouse location over the past 6 months. The images showed regular nighttime deliveries coordinated with police patrols, suggesting official protection for illegal activities. The community's response grew stronger by the hour. Local business owners came forward with security camera footage showing police officers conducting suspicious activities during late-night patrols. Each piece of evidence reinforced the pattern Rose had helped identify from her cell. As afternoon turned to evening, Rose noticed increased activity around the precinct's administrative offices. Through careful observation and conversations with sympathetic officers, she learned that Internal Affairs had discovered years of falsified reports systematically targeting specific neighborhoods. The FBI's forensic accountants made a startling discovery while tracking the money trail. The offshore accounts funding the operation were linked to a larger network of criminal enterprises. What had started as local police corruption had led them to uncover a sophisticated criminal organization with international connections. Rose's military training had taught her to look for patterns within patterns, and something about the operation structure seemed familiar. The hierarchical organization, the secure communications, the careful documentation, it all pointed to someone with extensive military or law enforcement background running the operation. As night fell, surveillance teams reported unusual movements at several locations connected to elite security solutions. Vehicles were seen removing equipment from offices, and key personnel were observed making hurried departures. The operation was clearly preparing for a major shutdown. Inside her cell, Rose maintained her calm demeanor while continuing to gather intelligence. Each nervous conversation overheard, each rushed movement observed added to the growing body of evidence. Her presence in the precinct had become a catalyst for exposing years of systematic corruption. The investigation had revealed a disturbing pattern. The corrupt officers weren't just targeting individuals, they were systematically dismantling entire communities. Each false arrest created a domino effect: families destabilized, properties devalued, neighborhoods transformed through carefully orchestrated fear and manipulation. As the sixth day drew to a close, federal agents prepared for the next phase of their operation. The evidence gathered was overwhelming: a criminal enterprise operating under the cover of law enforcement, using police powers to profit from community destruction. What had begun as a single wrongful arrest was about to expose one of the largest police corruption cases in the city's history. Day 7 dawned with an unexpected development. The FBI and NCIS launched a coordinated operation that would shake the corrupt system to its core. As federal agents moved into position around the city, Rose received her first visitor in her cell, the police department's new interim chief, brought in by the FBI to help clean up the corruption. The interim chief, a former military officer herself, looked at Rose with understanding. "Lieutenant Commander Washington, I apologize for what you've endured. Your sacrifice has helped us uncover something far bigger than we initially suspected." Rose nodded, knowing that her detention had served a greater purpose. Meanwhile, Captain Chen was briefing a joint task force of federal agents and military personnel. Surveillance photos covered the walls, showing connections between corrupt officers, elite security solutions, and international weapons traffickers. The operation had grown beyond a local corruption case; it was now a matter of national security. Rose's grandmother's house had become a command center for community action. Residents gathered with laptops and documents, working alongside civil rights attorneys to document decades of systematic abuse. Their evidence, combined with Rose's intelligence gathering, had created an ironclad case against the corrupt system. In the precinct, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Federal agents moved through the building, securing documents and computers. Officers who had participated in the corruption scheme found themselves under surveillance, their every move monitored as the investigation reached its critical phase. Agent Thompson received a crucial piece of information from a whistleblower within Elite Security Solutions. The company's CEO, Thomas Bradford, had scheduled an emergency board meeting at an off-site location. More importantly, they learned that Bradford had served in the same military unit as several key figures in the weapons trafficking operation. The community's role in the investigation deepened as more residents came forward. Local business owners provided security camera footage showing corrupt officers conducting late-night meetings with elite security personnel. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case and revealed the extent of the corruption. Rose's military training proved invaluable as she helped investigators understand the complex network they were unraveling. From her cell, she had mapped out patrol patterns, shift changes, and communication protocols that revealed a military-style operation hidden within the police department. By midday, the FBI had identified several storage facilities connected to Elite Security Solutions. Surveillance teams reported heavy activity around these locations, trucks arriving and departing at unusual hours, all under the watchful eye of corrupt officers providing security. The interim chief made a bold move, calling an emergency meeting of all precinct personnel. As federal agents stood guard, she announced the formation of an independent review board to examine every arrest made by the corrupt officers over the past 5 years. The message was clear: the old system was being dismantled. Rose's grandmother received unexpected support from local religious leaders and community organizations. They organized a peaceful gathering outside the precinct, demonstrating solidarity with all victims of false arrests. The media began picking up the story, shining a spotlight on the systematic corruption. Captain Chen's team made a breakthrough in analyzing the weapons trafficking operation. The serial numbers on recovered weapons matched those from military shipments that had supposedly been destroyed in a warehouse fire 2 years ago. The paper trail led directly to Elite Security Solutions' offshore accounts. Inside the precinct, honest officers began coming forward with information. Years of forced silence under the corrupt leadership had taken its toll, and many were eager to help clean up their department. Their testimonies revealed a culture of intimidation and coercion that had allowed the corruption to flourish. Rose noticed increased activity around the evidence room as federal agents conducted a thorough audit. Through careful observation, she saw several officers trying to access restricted areas, only to be turned away by FBI personnel. The net was tightening around the corrupt system. The investigation uncovered a sophisticated computer system within Elite Security Solutions that tracked every false arrest, property sale, and security contract. The system showed how the company had systematically targeted specific neighborhoods, using police corruption to create artificial crime waves that drove down property values. As evening approached, surveillance teams reported unusual activity at Bradford's private residence. Vehicles arrived and departed quickly, suggesting an attempt to move evidence or assets before federal agents could secure them. Thanks to Rose's intelligence training, investigators were already one step ahead. The community's documentation of false arrests had grown into a comprehensive database. Civil rights attorneys working with residents had identified over 300 cases following the same pattern. Traffic stops, planted evidence, pressure to accept plea deals, and subsequent property sales to shell companies. Rose's cell had become an unofficial briefing room. Her military experience helped investigators understand the hierarchical structure of the corruption network. Each piece of evidence she had gathered during her detention fitted perfectly into the larger picture of organized criminal activity. The day's investigations revealed connections between Elite Security Solutions and several international security firms known for operating in conflict zones. The weapons trafficking operation wasn't just supplying local criminals, it was part of a global network moving military-grade weapons through seemingly legitimate security companies. As night fell, federal agents prepared for the next phase of their operation. The evidence gathered was overwhelming. A criminal enterprise that had corrupted law enforcement, terrorized communities, and profited from systematic oppression. What had begun as Rose's wrongful arrest was about to expose corruption that reached far beyond the city limits. Day 8 brought the operation to its tipping point. At dawn, federal agents executed simultaneous raids on multiple locations across the city. The evidence gathered through Rose's careful observation and military expertise had laid the groundwork for what would become one of the largest police corruption busts in recent history. Inside the precinct, Officer Reynolds arrived for his shift, unaware that his world was about to crumble. As he walked through the door, he was met by FBI agents who had been waiting since before sunrise. His face fell as they presented him with evidence of his involvement in the corruption scheme, including clear footage from Rose's dashcam. Captain Chen coordinated with tactical teams from a mobile command center. Surveillance footage showed Elite Security Solutions employees hurriedly removing documents from their offices, but it was too late. Federal agents had already secured digital copies of everything through covert operations over the past week. Rose's grandmother's house had transformed into a hub of community triumph. Residents gathered to watch news reports of the raids, recognizing locations where they had witnessed suspicious activities for years. The community's detailed documentation had proven crucial in identifying targets for the federal investigation. In her cell, Rose maintained her composed demeanor while watching the operation unfold through the small window. Her SEAL training had taught her patience, the ability to wait for the perfect moment to strike. That moment had finally arrived, and she could see the impact rippling through the precinct. The interim police chief held an emergency press conference, revealing the scope of the corruption. She detailed how a network of corrupt officers had worked with elite security solutions to systematically target innocent civilians, particularly in historically black neighborhoods, through false arrests and planted evidence. Agent Thompson's team made a crucial breakthrough while searching Bradford's private office. Hidden behind a false wall, they discovered servers containing years of detailed records, lists of targets, profit calculations from property schemes, and communications with corrupt officials at various levels of government. The community's role in exposing the corruption received widespread recognition. News cameras captured residents sharing their stories of resilience and determination. Rose's grandmother emerged as a powerful voice, speaking about how the community had united to document and resist systematic oppression. Inside the precinct, honest officers watched in amazement as their corrupt colleagues were led away in handcuffs. The evidence was irrefutable: body cam footage had been altered, evidence had been planted, and innocent people had been framed in a massive scheme to profit from community destruction. Rose's military intelligence expertise proved invaluable in decoding encrypted communications found on the seized servers. The messages revealed a complex network of corruption extending beyond the police department, implicating several high-ranking city officials and business leaders. By midday, the FBI had uncovered the full scope of Elite Security Solutions' operation. The company had created a sophisticated system to identify vulnerable neighborhoods, orchestrate false arrests through corrupt officers, and then profit from both security contracts and property acquisitions. The weapons trafficking angle of the investigation exposed connections to international arms dealers. Captain Chen's team discovered that Elite Security Solutions had been using its legitimate security contracts as cover to move military-grade weapons through civilian areas. Rose observed increased activity around the precinct's administrative offices as federal agents uncovered years of falsified reports. Her trained eye noticed how the corrupt officers' confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the nervous behavior of people who knew their crimes had been exposed. The community's documentation efforts paid off in unexpected ways. Residents' photographs and videos of suspicious police activities matched perfectly with the evidence found in Elite Security Solutions servers, creating an airtight case against the corrupt officers and their civilian accomplices. As afternoon approached, surveillance teams reported a significant development. Thomas Bradford was observed attempting to board a private plane at a small airfield outside the city. Thanks to Rose's anticipation of possible escape routes, federal agents were already in position to intercept him. The investigation revealed how the corrupt system had specifically targeted community leaders and business owners who refused to sell their properties. False arrests had been used as a weapon to silence opposition and force compliance with the criminal enterprise's plans for neighborhood takeover. Rose's cell became the focal point of a powerful revelation. As federal agents interviewed more officers, they discovered that her arrest had been specifically ordered after she was identified as a potential threat to the operation. Her military background and community connections had made her a target. The day's events uncovered the full extent of the property scheme. Elite Security Solutions had created artificial crime waves through false arrests and planted evidence, driving down property values so their shell companies could acquire buildings at reduced prices. The community's resistance had finally exposed their tactics. As evening fell, the interim chief received word that several high-ranking city officials had been taken into custody. The corruption had reached into City Hall, with zoning changes and building permits being fast-tracked to support Elite Security Solutions' property acquisition scheme. Rose maintained her strategic position, continuing to gather intelligence even as the operation reached its climax. Her military training had taught her that crucial details often emerged during moments of crisis, and her observations would prove valuable in ensuring no aspect of the corruption escaped exposure. The day ended with a powerful scene outside the precinct. Community members gathered in a peaceful vigil, holding candles and sharing stories of resilience. What had begun as Rose's wrongful arrest had evolved into a movement that exposed decades of systematic corruption and united a community in the fight for justice. The ninth day marked the triumphant conclusion of what had become known as Operation Truth and Justice. Rose Washington stood outside the precinct, finally free, her military bearing intact despite 9 days of detention. The morning sun highlighted the determined expression on her face as she addressed a crowd of supporters, reporters, and federal agents. The scene at the federal courthouse downtown was historic. Thomas Bradford, Officer Reynolds, and 12 other corrupt officers were led into the building for their initial hearing. The evidence against them was overwhelming: thousands of documents, digital records, surveillance footage, and testimony from both community members and honest officers who had finally broken their silence. Captain Chen stood beside Rose at the press conference, explaining how her military intelligence training had been crucial in exposing the corruption. Lieutenant Commander Washington turned what they thought was their moment of power into their downfall. Her wrongful arrest gave us the perfect opportunity to observe their operation from the inside. Rose's grandmother's house had become a symbol of community resistance and triumph. Residents gathered there to celebrate as news broke of more arrests. City council members, property developers, and corrupt officials were being taken into custody as the full extent of the criminal enterprise came to light. The interim police chief announced sweeping reforms. Every case handled by the corrupt officers would be reviewed. A new community oversight board would be established, with Rose's grandmother among its founding members. The department's entire approach to community policing would be restructured with input from residents. Agent Thompson revealed the staggering scope of the operation they had uncovered. Elite Security Solutions had orchestrated over 500 false arrests in 3 years, leading to millions in fraudulent property acquisitions. The company's assets were frozen, and proceedings began to return properties to their rightful owners. The weapons trafficking investigation expanded internationally. Naval intelligence discovered that Elite Security Solutions had been part of a larger network moving military equipment through civilian channels. Rose's wrongful arrest had inadvertently exposed a national security threat that had operated undetected for years. Community members who had been victims of false arrests began receiving news of their cases being dismissed. The district attorney's office established a special unit to expedite the process of clearing wrongful convictions. Families torn apart by the corrupt system were finally seeing hope for reunion and justice. Rose's military superiors arrived at the precinct to officially acknowledge her role in the operation. What had begun as a simple drive to visit her grandmother had transformed into one of the most significant anti-corruption operations in recent history. Her training and resilience had turned a personal injustice into a catalyst for systematic change. The evidence room, once a hub of corruption, was transformed into a public documentation center. Here, community members could access records of the investigation, file reports of police misconduct, and participate in the department's new transparency initiatives. Rose's experience had shown the importance of community oversight. By midday, the FBI had completed their audit of Elite Security Solutions operations. The company's elaborate scheme had generated over $50 million through false arrests, property manipulation, and security contracts. All of it would now be subject to federal seizure and community restitution. The honest officers who had helped expose the corruption received recognition for their courage. Many had risked their careers to provide evidence and testimony. The interim chief established a new internal affairs unit, staffed by officers who had proven their integrity during the investigation. Rose's grandmother addressed the community gathering, her voice strong with emotion. They thought they could break us by targeting our children, our homes, our dignity. But they didn't count on our strength, our unity, and certainly didn't count on my granddaughter's training and determination. The weapons trafficking investigation led to unprecedented cooperation between local law enforcement and military intelligence. Rose's unique position as both a Navy SEAL and a community member had bridged gaps between agencies that had previously hindered such investigations. As afternoon approached, Rose visited her cell one last time. The small space that had been her observation post for 9 days would be preserved as a reminder. A plaque would be installed, commemorating how one woman's military training and community connections had exposed systematic corruption. The city council held an emergency session to begin addressing the damage done to affected communities. Plans were approved for a comprehensive review of all property transactions connected to elite security solutions. A fund was established to help families who had lost homes through the corrupt scheme. Rose's fellow Navy SEALs arrived to show their support. Their presence sent a powerful message: the corruption had not just targeted an individual, it had challenged the integrity of those who serve their country. The bonds between military and community grew stronger through this shared triumph. The day ended with a community celebration that represented more than just the end of corruption. It marked the beginning of a new era of police-community relations. Rose's experience had shown that true justice requires both professional expertise and community involvement. As the sun set, Rose and her grandmother sat on their porch, watching children play freely in streets that had once been under the shadow of corruption. The neighborhood was transforming, not through forced displacement, but through the restoration of justice and community empowerment. The legacy of Operation Truth and Justice would extend far beyond San Diego. Police departments nationwide began examining their own practices. Rose's story became a model for how military training, community activism, and federal intervention could work together to combat systematic corruption. Looking back, Rose realized that her wrongful arrest had served a greater purpose than anyone could have imagined. Her SEAL training had taught her to turn adversity into advantage, and now that lesson had helped an entire community reclaim its dignity and justice. The corrupt system hadn't just failed to break her, it had ultimately broken itself against the strength of truth, unity, and unwavering determination.